Hello, it's been 129 days since the horror which has engulfed Gaza began. And we've all seen what I would regard transparently as some of the worst atrocities of the 21st century. We don't know how many have been killed, violent deaths. The official count is around 30,000, but that's believed to be a huge underestimate because of the number who've been buried under rubble and never identified, as well as obviously deaths from the destruction of the medical system. Lack of access to food, water. And yet the horror is only escalating. There is a planned military offensive against Rafah, where the vast majority of the Palestinian population have been forcibly moved under threat of violence by the Israeli state. Now, I suppose many of us following this would just think transparently huge numbers of atrocities have been committed, war crimes, and Israel is being investigated for genocide by the International Criminal Court because of South Africa's case. But separate to that, there is the International Criminal Court. So it's very clear we separate them. The ICJ is the UN court, the highest court in the world. The ICC is separate from that. Now, there's been huge amounts of criticism of the International Criminal Court, not least its chief prosecutor. Its prosecutor, Karim Khan, who's actually a British lawyer. Now, there's no better person to speak to about this than our brilliant guest today, who's Triestino Mariniello, who is Professor of Law at Liverpool John Moores University, and he's crucially a member of the legal team representing the victims of Gaza before the International Criminal Court. Hey, how you doing?
Hi, morning. Many thanks for having me this morning, Owen.
It's a huge honor, honestly. Just to begin then, one of the reasons I've been meaning to speak to you for a while, that we have, I suppose, a hook, which is after huge amounts of criticism, we'll come on to the background of Karim Khan and the criticisms against him. So he's a KC, a barrister. Yesterday, he tweeted that he was deeply concerned by the reported bombardment. I don't know why. I mean, it was a bombardment, just so we're clear there, and potential ground incursion by Israeli forces in Rafah. He says his office has an ongoing and active investigation into the situation in Palestine. It's been taken forward with as a matter of the utmost urgency, with a view to bringing to justice those responsible for Rome Statute crimes. All wars have rules, and the laws applicable to armed conflict cannot be interpreted as to render them hollow or devoid of meaning. This has been my consistent message, including from Ramallah last year. Since that time, I've not seen any discernible change in conduct by Israel. As I've repeatedly emphasized, those who do not comply with the law should not complain later when my office takes action pursuant to its mandate. So he says, to all those involved, my office is actively investigating any crimes allegedly committed. Those who are in breach of the law will be held accountable. And then says he continues to call for the immediate release of the hostages. This is also represents an important focus of our investigations, which is completely reasonable. Taking hostages, of course, is a severe, grave war crime. But he also retweeted an article in the Observer newspaper by the journalist Simon Tisdall, which is a searing denunciation, actually, of the mass slaughter of children in Gaza. It talks about the sheer number of children who've been killed, who have lost their parents, who've been severely maimed. And quotes Gideon Levy, the Israeli author who I've interviewed, accusing the Israeli army of indulging in a violent rampage and of Israeli society refusing to reflect on the price it might ultimately pay, in which he says Israel is erasing generations in Gaza and its soldiers are killing children in numbers competing with the cruelest of wars. To me, that seems quite significant. I don't know what you think because you're the expert. But that statement and him choosing just before that to retweet that article, it seems quite significant, is it?
Yes, I agree with you. I think that both the statement and his retweet are very significant, and they are welcome, actually, actions by the prosecutor. And in particular, the fact that in his tweet, he refers to acting with the utmost urgency. I think this means that at least now his office is putting in place effective investigations in relation to the situation in Palestine and specifically in Gaza, and that we could expect some development in relation to this investigation in the next few months, maybe not immediately, but in the next few months. It seems that from his words, these cases might concern war crimes because he specifically refers to violation of international humanitarian law. So I think, first of all, it's a welcome statement in light of this, because the prosecutor is showing a commitment to further actions. On the other side, I think this also shows, or maybe confirms, a shift in his approach to the situation in Palestine, because this can be technically labeled as a preventive statement. Preventive statement is part of the policy of the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, which means to put perpetrators on notice, to just send a message that the office is looking at alleged international crimes currently being committed and could intervene if these crimes are not being stopped. As I was saying, it's part of the Office of the Prosecutor policy, but Karim Khan has always been very reluctant in issuing preventive statement in relation to the situation in Palestine. In contrast to his predecessor, the former prosecutor Fatou Bensouda, who has adopted this policy in Palestine. For instance, in 2018, Bensouda issued a statement in relation to the forced eviction of Bedouin communities in the West Bank, and that action to issue a preventive statement to Israel had a clear deterrent effect. For instance, at the time the government announced its decision to stop this eviction, just specifically mentioning the intervention of the International Criminal Court. While Khan, as I was saying, has always been reluctant, in November 2022, 198 human rights organizations explicitly sent him a letter in which invited him to issue a preventive statement in relation to the escalation of violence in the West Bank and in relation to the designation of Palestinian human rights groups as terrorists by the Israeli authorities, but he simply ignored that call by the Palestinians and not only organizations. So, and actually it seems that this was not part of this policy to issue preventive statements, but this is justly in contrast to what, for instance, he did in Ukraine, because in Ukraine he issued, since the beginning of the war, of the Russian invasion, he issued a number of preventive statements. So as I was saying, it's a welcome development. It's a shift in his approach, which shows finally that he is also adopting this policy that might have a deterrent effect. Although I believe that at this stage in Gaza, it's not a matter of anymore of preventive statement. It's crucial to have specific concrete cases and specific request for arrest warrant or summons to appear.
Just before I ask a bit more about him in relation to Palestine, some people again might get confused just about the international legal system, because obviously people are aware of the International Court of Justice and the case South Africa brought. The International Criminal Court is completely different. So can you just explain what it is? And it's just in terms of, you mentioned Ukraine, because about over a year after Russia's invasion, the ICC did issue arrest warrants, including for Vladimir Putin himself. So just explaining what the ICC is and how it works in that kind of way.
Well, of course, I mean, in contrast to what we can maybe read most of the times on newspapers, they make a confusion between the ICJ and the ICC. They are completely different judicial bodies. The International Court of Justice is a judicial body of the United Nations, as you correctly said, while the International Criminal Court does not have any competence on state responsibility. It deals with individual criminal responsibility on the assumptions that behind international crimes there are individuals. When we say international crimes, we mean in particular genocide, war crimes and crimes against humanity, and potentially the crime of aggression, and can intervene only if a state which has jurisdiction over these crimes is unable or unwilling to prosecute alleged perpetrators of this crime. So it's a so-called court of last resort, dealing with individuals and not with states. It has competence in the specific context of Palestine, because Palestine in 2015 has ratified the Statute of the International Criminal Court, has been admitted as a state party. This has been recognized by a trial chamber decision recently, and so the court has jurisdiction over all the international crimes allegedly committed on the territory of Palestine, even by Israeli nationals. Israel generally argues that the court does not have competence to deal with with their citizens, but this is not true from a legal perspective. As I said, the court intervenes because Palestine has ratified the statute. While in Ukraine is not a state party to the ICC, but Ukraine has accepted the jurisdiction of the court, and that's why the court can investigate alleged international crimes committed on the territory of Ukraine, even by nationals of other countries.
And that's an important point because, as you say, lots of people might have seen that Israel doesn't accept the jurisdiction of the ICC. My understanding is it's not just, so you've got, obviously, PLO, you've got Fatah, but is it true Hamas have accepted the jurisdiction of the ICC as well? Or have they not?
Well, I mean, Hamas is not.
They're not a state party, so
it's not a state party, so it's not up to Hamas to accept the jurisdiction. What, from a legal perspective, what is relevant is that the state of Palestine has ratified the statute, and so that's why not only ratified but also referred the situation in Palestine to the International Criminal Court. So that's why the court has come independently on any armed group's positions in relation to the ICC.
So even though we have in practice a divided entities of the West Bank and Gaza, officially in international law, the state of Palestine encompasses both, regardless of the political entities governing both that are different.
Exactly. That's irrelevant for the ICC. The court has competence over international crimes alleged committed in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and in the Gaza Strip, as clarified by the judges in February 2021.
Got you. That's interesting. Just because, again, people get confused, particularly, obviously, with the ICJ, because people go, well, Hamas isn't party to this, that, or the other. But in this case, what matters is the state of Palestine and therefore the authorities in both. That's not relevant. That's really important. In terms of just Karen, then, I don't know, I'm suddenly on first name terms with him, Karen Khan, who visited after the 7th of October atrocities, and obviously one would expect him to investigate the atrocities committed on the 7th of October. But he came under huge amounts of criticism because when he visited, he did go to the occupied territories in the West Bank, but he was refused entry to Gaza. That's my first understanding. But he refused to go to settlements, and he did meet with victims, but only very briefly. Just explain what the criticism was when he visited not long after the event.
So I think it's important to clarify that before October 2023, the prosecutor has been almost completely silent on the investigation in Palestine, despite the investigation was open. Has been open since March 2021, as I said, by the former prosecutor. So since Karim Khan took office in June 2021 until October, 29th of October 2023, the prosecutor had been almost, as I said, completely silent. He had not put in place any effective investigations, as is shown by a number of issues. For instance, he assigned the lowest budget to the investigation in question in Palestine, which was the lowest, just to be clear, 1/5 of the budget allocated to Ukraine, for instance. He never deployed any investigators. No staff investigator from his office visited Israel or Palestine. And as I said before, he never issued any preventive statement. So it seems that the prosecutor realized that there was an open investigation after the facts of the 7th of October, in particular on the 29th of October, when he visited the Rafah border. Since that moment, which was a positive development, to be clear, he undertook a number of actions, issued a number of statements, including the visit to Israel and Palestine that you were mentioning. On one side, this could appear, as I said, as a welcome development, but at the same time, it was, I think, also showing disturbing signals of continuation of the policy of double standards and selectivity. Why I'm saying this? Because the prosecutor, for instance, immediately accepted the invitation of Israeli victims, of families of the victims, which, to be clear, it's part of his mandate, and this is what everyone would expect from an international prosecutor. But what one will not expect is that until that moment, he had refused to meet with Palestinian victims. He had refused to meet with the legal representative of Palestinian victims, as well as with Palestinian human rights organizations that have made a huge effort by cooperating with the International Criminal Court so far and by providing information and evidence. In this way, I think he showed a sort of discrimination of victims on the basis of their nationality or ethnicity. This changed, as you were saying, when in Ramallah at the beginning of December, he met with the Palestinian victims in Ramallah. But at the end, it came out that these victims were very disappointed because he had allocated just 10 minutes to meet more than 10 victims. One of them was a woman coming from Gaza who had lost 30 family members. So they showed clear disappointment, and they were again concerned that the prosecutor was continuing with this policy of double standard, looking at the different approach that he was having in relation, as I said, to Israeli victims and Palestinian victims.
It's quite shocking just hearing that spelled out. It doesn't seem to bode well. I mean, those are choices he's made, which seem quite overt.
Yes, I mean, this is, as I said, appears quite disturbing. On one side, as I said, you would expect that's part of his mandate, and it's really a positive development. On the other side, it's really difficult to understand why, at least until that moment, at least until December 2023, the prosecutor has really refused any formal engagement with the Palestinian victims or Palestinian legal representative of victims and human rights organizations.
Yeah, I mean, that's, as I know, would begrudge him for meeting with Israeli victims, but the double standard there seems pretty shocking. But I mean, this is a systemic problem, isn't it? That what we're talking about is the double standards which have long been applied, obviously, in terms of Israel and Palestine, because what we've seen in the past few months is shocking. And as I said, reasonably, they are some of the worst atrocities of the 21st century. We've had, obviously, horrible wars. We've had Syria. We've had what's happened in Libya. We've had obviously Ukraine. We've Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo. We've had lots of horrible atrocities, but these, I mean, reasonably clearly rank up there. But in terms of before that, there's been a long history of other, 2014, 2008, 2009 Israeli onslaughts where Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem have documented two things. One, widespread alleged war crimes, and two, the failure of the Israeli state to take any measures against those who have clearly committed alleged war crimes. So what in terms of double standards with the ICC and the whole international system, what's that meant in practice before this even happened?
Sure. If we talk about double standards, I think please just let me say a few words about what I was saying before in relation to Karim Khan's approach to the situation after October, because as I said, on one side, this was a welcome initiative, but on the other side, as I said, was raising concerns of double standards, not only in relation to the engagement with victims, but also when he spoke about alleged international crimes that his office was investigating. He was very strong and accurate in firmly condemning Hamas attacks, and again, that's that's really in line with what one would expect it from him. But on the other side, one could not fail to notice the imbalance of words and how he was on the other side approaching what was happening in Gaza or in the West Bank as well. For instance, in all these statements, he focused a lot on non-state actors' responsibility, settlers' violence, but he never mentioned settlements and the policy of the states, which are relevant under the Rome Statute because these are war crimes, and unless he says something different. I mean, these are still part of the investigation of his office. He never mentioned the killing of hundreds of people by the IDF or by settlers in the West Bank. As regards Gaza, he never mentioned the mass killings. Almost 40,000 people at the moment in Gaza. He never mentioned the extensive destruction of civilian houses and infrastructure in the West Bank. he omitted any references to the context in which this war is taking place, which is the context of a siege, which was already going, blockading Gaza for the last 16, 17 years, and which itself may amount to a crime against humanity. So that's why it's relevant under the statute of the International Criminal Court. But as you say, this is a systemic problem which comes from far. The International Criminal Court has failed in relation to the situation in Palestine since 2009. In 2009, the state of Palestine accepted the jurisdiction after the military operation in Gaza cast lead. And after 3 years of preliminary examination, the then prosecutor of the ICC, the Argentinian lawyer Luis Moreno Campo, who in these days has been very vocal on what's happening in Gaza, he decided to not open an investigation. To say it better, he decided not to decide because he said that it was not clear whether Palestine was a state, and he delegated this decision to political bodies like the UN General Assembly and the ICC Assembly of State Parties. But even when the UN General Assembly decided in November 2022 2012 that Palestine was a state, to make it shorter, he now went back on his decision. So just to make really this short, I will say that the biggest problem here is the exceptionalism with which the International Criminal Court, but not only, more generally, Western states, not only international organizations, with which they have treated the most serious violation of international law when it comes to Israel. This exceptionalism is clearly in contrast to the approach that the ICC, but also states, have had in other contexts. And here the most, of course, clear case is the one in Ukraine, for instance. The same court has been very swift and prompt in the office of the prosecutor here in requesting arrest warrant against Russian nationals, while after 15 years there has never been a request of arrest warrant or summons to appear in Palestine. I strongly believe that the impunity enjoyed by Israel and by the Israeli leaders, political and military leaders, is one of the main causes of the serious violation of international law, which may amount to war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. For the first time, this impunity has been violated by the decision of the International Court of Justice, but this has not happened in relation to international criminal tribunals. So as far as this exceptionalism is ongoing, as far as in particular here Western states decide to place Israel above the law, above international law, I don't think this will be the last war in Gaza or will be the last serious violation of international law that we will have in the specific context. If I can add this, Owen, sometimes the arguments used by states in order to create a double standard and to place Israel above international law is that it's not a matter for international law here, it's politics that they have to decide, they have to intervene, because an intervention by an international tribunal could have an impact, for instance, on an alleged peace process. The question, of course, is which is the peace process ongoing? I mean, we were clearly seeing the last, which is not really a peace process, last attempt was the so-called Trump plan, which was a plan of annexation of Palestinian territory without the involvement of Palestine. So the arguments generally used also by states, I think, are really biased and showing how, when it comes to powerful states, like in particular Israel, international justice for Western states has to remain asymmetrical, so as to be implemented only against some states, but not against other states. Sorry to be long.
No, that's brilliant. That makes perfect sense. I mean, before, just in terms of, because I'm interested in whether the question of impunity and that disintegrating. I mean, it's just following on what you just said there. When I interviewed Razi Gal, who is an Israeli-American associate professor of genocide and Holocaust studies, in which he described what's happening in Gaza textbook genocide. And one of the reasons he said that was the question of intent. And the reason that's in that, he said it's very rare in history for basically the leaders of a state engaged in genocide to be so open in stating that in public. You know, you often they clothe what they're doing in denial, pseudo-humanitarian defenses, that kind of thing. It's rare for that to happen. And I guess the point you're making there is that's actually to do with impunity, that you basically have an Israeli leadership which quite rationally thinks it can basically get away with anything. And if you get that impunity, it leads to arrogance, or, well, is it even hubris if you know you're going to get away with it? You basically, the reason they speak like this, the reason they say genocidal things in public is they think we're immune, we're protected, we're not going to suffer any consequences, so we can be open and honest in what we say. And in this, you know, Western politicians and many media outlets just took a blind eye to this rhetoric. It's almost like it never happened. It's not framed our understanding of the war. So is that basically, that's why it's to do with impunity? That's what you argue.
Exactly, that's what I was trying to say. I mean, when I say that impunity is for me, one of the main causes behind, you know, this serious violation of international law, the awareness that whatever you put in place in that specific context, you are going, you know, to escape justice. Also because from an individual criminal responsibility perspective, there is no alternative today at the International Criminal Court, unless we look at some specific states using universal jurisdiction. And it appears that there is an ongoing case, for instance, in Switzerland against the Israeli president for international crimes. But generally, the state that should here have a legal obligation to exercise their jurisdiction, first of all, here are Palestine and Israel. Palestine is unable to prosecute for a number of reasons, you know, Israeli political and military leaders. But Israel, in contrast to the rhetoric that we hear a lot by states, but also by media, is unwilling to prosecute, investigate any political or military leader for serious violation of international law. You won't find any criminal proceedings domestically in Israel for the alleged commission of international crimes, despite the fact that we are talking of one of the most over-documented contexts for the alleged commission of international crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. We hear a lot this saying that Israel has a working judicial system that can bring to justice perpetrators. To be honest, this does not reflect the position of the human rights group you were mentioning before, even Israelis. The Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem, together with the Palestinian Center for Human Rights in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip, they have provided a very detailed assessment in which they show how the Israeli military justice system is put in place to whitewash war crimes, in particular in relation to the Great March of Return. In other words, is put in place to shield perpetrators of international crimes rather than to bring justice. And that's why, for instance, in contexts like the Gaza war in 2014, protective age, there has not been any attempt to try political or senior leaders. To the extent of my knowledge, only some soldiers have been convicted for the theft of a credit card to Palestinians in the West Bank, despite, again, the abundance of evidence, not because I say it, but because it's been documented also by UN independent commissions of inquiry, which have established since 2007-8, so Castro-led military operation that Israel has put in place. There are reasonable grounds to believe that Israel has committed war crimes in this specific case in the Gaza Strip. What is surprising and concerning for a lawyer in particular is that when it came to Ukraine, states put in place an unprecedented call for accountability. 43 states invoked the intervention of the ICC. They provided ad hoc funds to the International Criminal Court. They proposed, including the UK, the establishment of special tribunals, including tribunals for the crime of aggression. You know, in this list of states, there are several states which have formally opposed to any investigation in Palestine. This is the policy of double standards, believing that there are some individuals that should be brought to justice and some victims that deserve to justice. In other words, discriminating perpetrators and victims on the basis of their nationality or ethnicity. This is not only a problem, just to be clear, for the victims in this context. This is a problem for the credibility and the legitimacy of the entire international justice system and more generally of the international law order that has been created after the end of the Second World War.
Just before I ask, just in terms of where this could end up, there's the question of funding, isn't there? which people might not be aware of, which is the ICC needs. I mean, there was a previous investigation. I can't remember. Was it into alleged US war crimes, perhaps in Iraq? I could have got that wrong. But they sorry, say that again.
UK in Iraq and US in Afghanistan.
And they abandoned. Oh, yeah, of course, that's right. And they abandoned that because of lack of funding, basically. So there is a question of funding from donor states. Could you expand why that's what that is?
Well, yes. I mean, of course, the court does not have the means to investigate all the international crimes alleged committed, in all the contexts in which it has jurisdiction. This is potentially an universal court, which could have universal jurisdiction on the basis of referrals by the Security Council. In Iraq, the former prosecutor here decided not to continue with the investigation because it said that the UK, so the British authorities, had jurisdiction and they were willing and able to exercise this jurisdiction over British nationals alleged responsible of war crimes in Iraq, despite the fact here that there has never been any effective investigation and prosecution, and despite all the pressures by the different British governments over independent commissions, national commissions for the investigation. In Afghanistan, the first official decision taken by Karim Khan was to freeze the investigation against US nationals, so members of the CIA and of the army, in relation to war crimes alleged committed in Afghanistan, including the widespread and systematic use of torture of detainees in Afghanistan. We all remember the images at the time. So, and specifically, that's correct what you say, he referred to the lack of resources to freeze this investigation. But then at the same time, he was requesting funds in relation to the situation in Ukraine, and states provided ad hoc financial contribution. I think that the lack of financial resources is a problem for an institution like the ICC, but at the same time, ad hoc financial contributions are very problematic because they enable states to decide where the prosecutor should look at and which investigation should be prioritized, while the state parties of the ICC should just provide their financial contribution to the court, and then it's up to the court, and in particular to the office of the prosecutor here, to decide how to use these resources. I think the same applies also to Palestine, not only to Ukraine. So establishing on which investigations these funds should go is a violation of the regulations of the court in my views.
Finally, what I want to talk to you is about something I think will be on people's mind throughout this, which is we started obviously talking a lot about impunity, which Israel has long enjoyed. You can see that crumbling. The fact that South Africa's case at the International Court of Justice and then provisional measures being issued, which, I mean, you've seen a UN official amongst others has said Israel's clearly in breach of, or they said, I think it seems as though they might be in breach of, which was diplomatic speak, I think. But in any case, and you can already see public opinion shifting in various countries, which Israel has long depended on for support for weapons, for example. Western leaders responding to that, not by doing anything, I suppose, with the levers they actually have, but by their rhetoric getting a bit queasy about Israel's behavior. I just wonder, could you see a possibility where you end up, obviously people will be thinking of Benjamin Netanyahu being prosecuted, but the defense minister you mentioned, Yoav Gallant, who implemented the siege and did two things actually. Many things, but two key points I would say is he called for a siege of everything on the basis they're fighting human animals. But less remarked upon, though the ICJ remarked upon this in their judgment, is that he called for all restrictions he said he'd removed all restrictions on the Israeli Defense Force, which is for some reason never really commented upon. So do you see this as possible? Do you think, is it possible one day you could end up with Israeli leaders, generals, Israeli soldiers who keep posting what many of us would consider to be clear war crimes on TikTok for comic amusement, for Israeli domestic consumption? Is that theoretical? Could you see that happening? Is it possible?
Well, I think the answer is yes. I think that's possible. From what's we have seen so far from the evidence in relation to the alleged commission of international crime, specifically in Gaza, but not only in the West Bank. This entails the involvement of political and military Israeli leaders. So, to be honest, I will be surprised to see requests of arrest warrant against the so-called small fishes, in this case soldiers, rather than directing the criminal proceedings against senior and political leaders. The prosecutor, in a previous statement, he mentioned an investigation in relation to starvation, which is a war crime under the statute of the ICC, depriving civilian population of essential goods like water, fuel, electricity, and food. And we have seen the effects of this total siege. No, even premature babies in the Gaza hospital have died because of the lack of electricity. So in that case, if this is one of the war crimes going to select, everyone would expected the charges raised against Israeli political military leaders, in particular, as you were mentioning, the Minister of Defense, Gallant, who established the total siege. If it's going to look at genocide, of course, this will call into question the responsibility of those senior political leaders who have made clear genocidal statement and have shown, as agreed by the International Court of Justice, a plausible genocidal intent, which is generally the most difficult intent element of genocide to prove. Of course, then the question will be whether or not this arrest warrant, in case they are issued against, by the judges, not by the prosecutor, against Israeli military and political leaders, are going to implement it or not. The court has issued so far a number of arrest warrants, including against Putin, that have not been implemented. But this does not mean that they are not effective, that they are not useful, or that on this basis they should not be issued, because they can have a number of effects also on political grounds, but in particular they could be implemented in the future, like it ought to happen in relation to other international criminal trials. So just to conclude this, I would expect action at this stage by the prosecutor. He has announced with the utmost urgency, and this action, I would be surprised if it did not concern Israeli political and military leaders. Here, it's not only a matter of individual criminal responsibility of soldiers. Here, it's a matter of the rules of engagement that the soldiers have received, and as we can see it, without any restraints, without any respect of basic principles of international humanitarian law. So the orders to violate the principle of distinction, in other words, bombing hospitals, in general civilians and civilian objects, comes from above, comes from senior political and military leaders. And this is the ones that generally the International Criminal Tribunals looks at their responsibility, the major responsible of these crimes.
So just finally on that, because as you know, the ICC did issue a response, for example, against Vladimir Putin. He was supposed to travel to South Africa, to Cape Town, for a international conference, and the South African government warned that they would actually legally be obliged to arrest him. So he didn't. I think he had to join on Zoom or something. But the point is, I suppose, which is, in theory, you could get arrest warrants issued. But I guess, if they were issued this week or next week, which obviously won't happen, but just theoretically, if that happened, the point is, who knows how things can shift in 5 or 10 years? Who knows how, the winds can change, and you can already see Israel's impunity dissolving a bit. And we don't know how things will shift in 5 to 10 years. We live in a very, the world is in flux. The global south is flexing its muscles more than it did, hence South Africa's case. So you could end up with an arrest warrant, and then 5, 10 years, who knows, 15 years. But there could still be justice in the future at some point, theoretically. That's not out of the question.
If I can add on that, but just looking at the International Court of Justice, I have heard a lot of criticism to the International Court of Justice because its decision cannot be executed, cannot be implemented. It's legally binding, but then there will be no effect. I think this is not true at all. We are already seeing the effects of the intervention of the International Court of Justice in establishing accountability for the first time since 1948, in establishing accountability for Israel. A number of of companies are just ending their cooperation with Israeli military companies, including public institutions like in Belgium. And yesterday, Dutch court decided that the Dutch government had to stop the sale of parts of jet fighters F-35 to the Netherlands. So what I'm saying is that we are already seeing the effects, and if the ICC is also contributing to put an end to impunity in this specific context, the effects will be even more. And to be clear, at this stage, especially after the intervention of the ICC, the prosecutor cannot be silent anymore. It will be a total deprivation, and it would completely undermine his institution of any credibility and legitimacy. I mean, the credibility in the global south of the International Criminal Court is already very, very low. When I say in global south, I refer to states, but to human rights groups, to civil society. How then the court could be credible in any future investigation or any future cases in other parts of the world?
And you say, as you know, the ICJ decision has led to that effect in terms of, in Belgium, Netherlands, in terms of preventing arms sales potentially to Israel. But if the ICC then moved, you could see huge domestic pressure in states like the US. The key, basically, I mean, the US is the main protector and defender of Israel and its impunity as the last superpower on earth. But you could see that would make a huge difference probably in the internal political dynamics of those states, and that would put pressure on Israel because they're the ones providing weapons and diplomatic support for Israel.
I agree. And also from a legal perspective involving third states, in this case, responsibility or individual criminal responsibility for aiding and abetting the commission of international crimes. There has already been a case in the US against Biden, Blinken, and Biden in which a federal court established that it did not have any jurisdiction, but that genocide was plausible, and implored the Biden administration to stop financial and military contribution to Israel. So these are already important, I think, messages. And after the intervention of the ICJ and potentially of the ICC, even these domestic proceedings are going to increase. And the possibility that third states or individuals from third states are going to be brought to justice, I think also would be a significant development.
And indeed, I've actually interviewed a lawyer who's leading the case in Britain to try and take legal action against British politicians. So you can see a kind of pincer movement of different legal actions in terms of Israel, but also the politicians in Western countries which have facilitated what's happened. Triestino, that was brilliant. That was so educational. Learned a huge amount there. And I do think, despite, as we discussed, the huge systemic failings and also, the credible frustrations with the prosecutor, it is possible to see how things could shift in a way that people could not have imagined, certainly a few months ago. So that, I think, is something worth people mulling over. Do share this video, press like and subscribe. But Triestino, thank you so much. That was fantastic.
Thank you very much, Owen. It was lovely to talk with you this morning.